welcome to BloombergQuint. We have got the first advance estimates for FY20 GDP, which suggest, well, what we already knew, that growth is going to be exceptionally weak in this year. 5% GDP growth is being projected for the full year. That's real GDP growth. Nominal GDP growth is being projected at 7.5%. An implication of this data is also going to fall on the fiscal deficit. Lower nominal GDP growth will mean that just on the basis of mathematics, you will see fiscal deficit move up to about 3.44% from the 3.3% which the government is targeting. Joining us to talk about the data and to help us analyze it, Soumya Kanti Ghosh of State Bank of India and Saugata Bhattacharya of Axis Bank. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak to us. Appreciate it. Saugata, let me come to you first. Reinforces what we already know about the weakness in the economy, but what stood out for you in the data?
No, I mean, based on expectations, I mean, we had predicted a 5%. So the thing that stands out probably in this is the weak capex number. So, I mean, the capex number that we had thought would be about 1 point fixed capital formation in technical terms would be about 1.8% is actually about 1%, even less than 1%. So I think the broad estimates are that. And the second part is the nominal growth number. I mean, of course, it's a combination of the WPI, CPI and other factors. WPI average for the year would be about 1.9% odd. So, I mean, it's more or less in line, but it's still a remarkable number, that's 7.5% nominal growth. So these are the two factors of the GDP, which is a little bit out of the envelope of our current expectations.
All right, and I'll come to more analysis on that. But Soumya Kanti, do you want to go ahead with your initial read into this number?
Yeah, I think we had revised our number to 5% in the beginning of November, but the moot point is that this number has a shelf life of only 2 months. So possibly by the end of January and by February, we could see another 20 to 40 basis point downward revision to this data. I mean, in 20 possibly in February and 20 more in the May when the final numbers come. So from that point of view, because if we have to attain 5%, we need to have a growth rate of around 5.5% in Q4, which looks impossible. So given the fact, I think there is more to this number, and another simple thing which we can come later is basically the nominal GDP growth that Saugata pointed out, but I would like to go a step further and look at the distribution of the deflator and the real GDP. The deflator is at 2.4% and the GDP is at 5%. Given the way that the prices have been moving, I think the deflator could actually move up, and that supports our contention that the real GDP number could now be closer to 4.5 in the current fiscal rather than being at 5 for this fiscal.
Oh, that's interesting. But Saugata, can I request you to just focus a little bit more on the nominal GDP? Firstly, a print of 7.5%. And secondly, its implications just on pure mathematics for the fiscal deficit. I mean, what happens to the actually revenue expenditure math, we'll find out on 1st of February. But just on the basis of this, you go up to 3.44%.
That's right. So, I mean, with the nominal 3.3% fiscal deficit that was budgeted earlier this year in July, the fiscal FRBM Act, as the finance minister had emphasized at that point in time, that she would like to remain within the ambit of the FRBM law. So that could have taken the fiscal deficit up to about 3.8% of GDP if they were to stick to the law. So about 1 to 1.5% of that additional 5% is been eaten away by the drop in the nominal GDP. So that leaves just about another 3.5% in which the government can play around with increasing the fiscal deficit or whatever. I mean, with the expenditures. On top of this is the reported cutbacks on expenditures that the government is planning, probably as a response to the expected drop in nominal growth and the expected rate in the fiscal deficit. So which, taken together, I think supports Soumya's contention that the risks to this current 5% number is probably to the downside. Forget about all the other geopolitical and other considerations. So just on the basis of the maths, given this and the problem with the fisc and the lack of pickup in credit, I think tilts the risks to the downside.
Soumya, do you agree? All three aspects, that the government may cut spending so that fairly strong number on government consumption that you're seeing may actually come down, plus the deflator problem that you've talked about, you would expect the number to be lower as well.
Yeah, I think I would expect the number to be lower. Just I think I have to add to Saugata's point, I think, and to your point, I think the fiscal deficit budgeted was around 3.34%. So it moves up to 3.5% because of this nominal GDP growth rate. So on the top of that, if you actually take into account the revenue shortfall and make a fair bit of calculation, the deficit could actually come at around fiscal deficit 3.8%. That means that the fiscal deficit for the current year could be at 7.75 lakh crores against the budgeted amount of 7.03 lakh crores. So that means a slippage of 70,000 crores odd. So that has implications for the market in terms of possibly some additional borrowing. And the other point which I said, that has also implication for the next fiscal, because I think the next fiscal now also we could be looking at a growth rate which will be much lower than the 6%. The RBI has projected 5.9 to 6.3%. Possibly we could be at the lower end of that growth rate as of now. So my sense is that, I mean, to your specific point on the number of the government final consumption expenditure, I think given the fact that the government will be cutting back expenditure, there are reports that it could be around 2 lakh crores. I think that number could actually be on the downside. So if I take all these factors into constant, I don't see, I mean, too much of an hope in the next 2-3 months in terms of a recovery.
Gosh, if I just, Saugata, take a step back and, listening to both of you, it's a scary situation for the economy, right? I mean, I'll get into, the specifics, but 5% real GDP with the expectation of such a shallow recovery even next year, nominal GDP 7.5 to 8%, a tough situation.
Yes, it is. I mean, no, I mean, I know, I can sympathize with all of us here that the options for the government, for the Reserve Bank, for all the policy authorities are relatively limited. But remember, the good part of next year's nominal growth is that inflation is likely to be higher, which is not very comforting, limits other policy levers, but at least, I mean, you'll get a boost if we are getting to about a 5.5% growth next year. With about a 4.5% inflation, maybe the deflator will be a bit lower. So you're getting to about a 10% growth, which is better than the 7.5 numbers that we are seeing here.
All right. Okay, a couple of other points I want to focus on. Soumya, the fixed capital formation, sub 1%. This is a consequence of just capacity utilization falling even further, or is this more about credit? What is it about?
No, I think capacity creation has been declining, and my sense is that there is still a lot of uncertainty in several sectors. For example, telecom is one of them. We don't have a clear picture of how the telecom sector, those dues will come through. So that's point number one. And the point number two is that if you actually look into the credit growth, there has been a significant deceleration in the last couple of months, and the important point is that there has been deleveraging by the corporates, but as per the latest data, we can also see that there is an element of consumer also now deleveraging. So if I take all these factors into account, all these factors are actually uncertain for an investment pickup. And my sense is that this number of 1% reflects the ground realities, and possibly, I mean, I don't foresee a significant even a capex revival in the next couple of months, at least for till the first quarter of next fiscal.
Saugata, there was this data that the RBI had put out, which was showing a little bit of a build-up in the reserves and surplus of the corporates. The reason I'm bringing that up is because if you marry that, which is slightly better situation of manufacturing companies in terms of their balance sheet, with the fact that there is no investment happening, then it's a pure demand problem, right? Or a demand or a confidence problem.
No, you're absolutely right. So this is, if you compare this current slowdown with the one in 2015, 2013, probably even the 2008-9 major drop in 2008-9, to my mind, I mean, there are these two factors which I've talked with you about before that stand out about this current slowdown. First, that unlike the others which have a larger supply shock element to those slowdowns, this one is more demand. And the reason that this is more a demand-led slowdown is what Soumya was talking about, all the twin, triple, quadruple, quintuple balance sheet problems that we are now beginning to face. And with the problems in the financial sector, this demand slowdown came in with a financial shock. So this was the first slowdown amongst all the 3 or the 4 that we have seen before that was led by the financial sector. And that seems to have spilled over into the real sector, as opposed to a real sector slowdown then affecting the financial sector slowdown. So yes, I mean, some of the, we talk about the cyclical versus the structural components of the current slowdown. To my mind, despite the Reserve Bank, IMF, other institutions predicting that there is a cyclical component in the slowdown, my sense is that there is a larger structural element to the current slowdown, which is why we expect the recovery to be much more drawn out than we had earlier expected.
Soumya, your thoughts on this? And I'll throw in now the personal consumption expenditure data as well. Again, weak at sub 6%, so below trend for sure.
Yes, I think the private funnel consumption expenditure data, which will be revised downwards, is actually at as the lowest since in FY13, when it was around, I think, at 5.5%. But keeping aside that, I would tend to agree with Saugata in terms of a more structural element to the current slowdown, because one aspect which we would like to highlight is that currently, if you look into the resolutions which are happening in the financial sector space, all this resolution has been for a significant period of time. And as per my understanding, whenever a company gets into a resolution, there is a layoff of the contractual employees, and the permanent employees who are on the roll, they don't get a salary till the resolution is over. So this in fact is having a significant impact on the consumption slowdown, even though we admit the fact that the 4% of the Indians pay taxes. But if you look into their gross taxable income, which is I think around 40 lakh crores, which is 1/3 of the total private funnel consumption expenditure of India. So if I take that factor into consideration, I think the slowdown has been perpetuated by possibly resolutions which have been elongated and other problems of the financial sectors which has started to haunt from the last September 2018. So that's why we are not too much convinced about an immediate recovery, because this cannot take place until and unless all these resolutions which are happening actually goes through. And there is a time also for pickup once this happens. So therefore, capacity creation will also not happen immediately. Consumption will also not happen immediately. It will only happen with a lag. And maybe that could put a brake on the next year growth rate as well to below 6%.
Okay. Let me just ask a couple of questions on both budget and policy. Saugata, so this data will in some ways underpin what the budget will project. So it'll be a very tough set of projections, both in terms of revenue, but we've seen in the past that the economic survey sometimes has a slightly different estimate of nominal GDP, etc. We'll have to watch for the numbers that they use in the budget this time, right?
Yes. You're very right. I mean, I think that's one of the key asks of the FY21 budget, that the budget projections be made more realistic as compared to the last couple of budgets that we have seen, which has overestimated the nominal growth rates of GDP, etc. And as a consequence, I mean, we've had to revise revenue recoveries, etc. down. So I think that's one key part that we will all look forward to the budget in terms of how realistic the budget projections are in terms of the expected nominal and real GDP recovery. But to flip Soumya's point round, I think this is pretty much the only silver lining that I see in this current environment, that given the fact that the case laws of the recovery process, the IBC process, the NCLT process are being put in place, hopefully, of course, I mean, as Soumya is completely right, that this is not likely to be very evident at least in the first half of the next year, FY21. But presumably, some of the resolution mechanisms that we are likely to see going ahead are likely to be more expedited than all the problems in the IBC that we have seen thus far, the elongated process of resolution and recovery. And that probably is going to add to some extent capacity. The stranded assets that are just lying idle now will probably come back into line, if not FY21, quickly on into FY22, is probably one of the larger optimistic scenarios that we see in this current environment.
Soumya, so what will you be looking out for in terms of doable things in the budget? They can say they're going to spend on infrastructure. Nobody's going to believe all of that in the current environment, to be honest. That combined with, well, do you see any room for monetary policy from here on? I think today the governor has made some comments which sound borderline hawkish, so I don't know whether that temporary pause will be very temporary.
Yeah, I think, Ira, regarding the monetary policy, I think 2 days later we will see the CPI numbers, which could be actually be close to 7%. So we are earlier expecting it to be around 6.3 or 6.4. Now the numbers suggest it could be actually much higher than that. And possibly there will be no room to cut in the February policy. The April numbers also will be significantly higher. So the rate cut, if it at all happens, we don't think now there could be a rate cut cycle. It could be a prolonged pause. It could be happen if it happens in June policy. So as of now, there is no possibility of monetary accommodation. Now coming to your specific question on the budget, let me throw you a small number. I think if you look into this year nominal GDP, it is at 204 lakh crores. And if you are assuming that a very modest 10% GDP growth rate, nominal GDP for next year, that takes it to 224 lakh crores. So at 3.7%, if the deficit for next year fiscal is 3.6 to 3.7%, that makes the total number over 8 lakh crores. I think it could be around 8.1 to 8.2 lakh crores. So this year the budgeted borrowing is at 7 lakh crores. So next year we could be looking at a significantly higher budgeted number. So that will also have an impact on the debt market if there is some amount of recovery starts happening. And regarding the last point of the doable things in the budget, I think the first thing they should do is that they should make the numbers more realistic, because we have seen that the markets need to be convinced about the numbers. Markets are more concerned about the arithmetic of the numbers rather than what is the rather than the technical things of crowding in or crowding out, because at the end of the day, if the numbers don't match, I think markets are always scary that there could be some amount of additional borrowing which could happen at the end of last year, which could be the case this year also.
All right, tough situation, like I said. I'll end the discussion here. Look forward to your detailed notes on what you make of the economy. Saugata, Soumya, thanks so much for joining us here on BloombergQuint. Thanks so much for watching. Do go on to BloombergQuint.com. We've got all the math behind this number up, and of course, we'll have the analysis up soon.